Anna Komnenos, the emperor's daughter, later described them with aristocratic disdain. A certain Frankish Peter, called the Hermit, led a numberless host of common people, men and women who had left their homes, some with wagons, others on foot. They were more numerous than the sands of the seashore or the stars of heaven. Each bore a cross on his shoulder. Alexios faced a dilemma. He couldn't feed this vast crowd indefinitely, but he also couldn't simply turn them away. They were, after all, fellow Christians who had come to help fight the Turks. His solution was pragmatic, but ultimately fatal. He ferried them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as quickly as possible, warning them to wait for the main crusading armies before advancing. They didn't listen. Drunk on early successes against lightly defended villages, the People's Crusade split into competing groups. French and German contingents raided separately, each trying to outdo the other in capturing booty. They tortured and killed Turkish civilians with the same brutality they had shown to Jews in the Rhineland. The Turkish response was swift and devastating. Kilij Arslan, the young Seljuk Sultan of Rum, had initially dismissed reports of the Frankish invasion. These ragged pilgrims hardly seemed a threat, but when they began attacking his territory, he gathered his forces. On October 21st, 1096, near the village of Sivato, the Turkish army fell upon the People's Crusade. It was not a battle but a massacre. The Crusaders, mostly untrained peasants with improvised weapons, were cut down by mounted archers who struck from a distance, never allowing them to close for hand-to-hand combat. A handful of survivors made it back to a fortified camp by the sea, where they held out until Byzantine ships rescued them. Of the tens of thousands who had crossed into Asia, only about 3,000 survived. The road to Sivato was littered with bones that would still be visible years later when the main crusading armies passed by. Peter the Hermit himself survived, having been in Constantinople when the disaster struck. He would attach himself to the prince's armies and eventually see Jerusalem. But the movement he had inspired was dead, drowned in blood before it could reach the Holy Land. The failure of the People's Crusade taught harsh lessons. Holy enthusiasm was not enough. Miracles would not replace military discipline. The Turks were not the weak, cowardly enemies that propaganda had portrayed. This would be a long, hard war, requiring professional soldiers and careful planning. But perhaps the most important lesson was one that few learned at the time. Religious war, once unleashed, was almost impossible to control. The same fervour that inspired men to march thousands of miles for their faith could also inspire them to slaughter their neighbours. The cross that was meant to unite Christendom had become a symbol of division and death. As autumn turned to winter in 1096, the real First Crusade was just beginning. The great nobles of Europe, men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Robert of Normandy, were finally ready to march. They had learned from Peter's failure. Their armies were disciplined, well-equipped, and led by experienced commanders. But they would face challenges that made the People's Crusade look like a pleasant pilgrimage. The road to Jerusalem led through some of the harshest terrain on earth, past cities defended by determined enemies, through lands where food and water were scarce, and disease was rampant. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios watched their approach with mixed feelings. These were the reinforcements he had requested, but they were also potential conquerors. Each prince commanded forces that could threaten Constantinople itself. Managing them would require all his diplomatic skill. The Muslim world, shocked by the savagery of the People's Crusade, but reassured by its failure, began to take the Frankish threat more seriously. Messages flew between Damascus and Cairo, between Baghdad and Aleppo. The Christians were coming in force this time. The real war for the Holy Land was about to begin. And in the West, those who had taken the cross said their final farewells. Knights confessed their sins and received communion. Wives and mothers wept. Children too young to understand wondered why their fathers were leaving. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, who would march with the Crusaders, captured the pain of these partings. Oh, what grief there was, what sighs, what weeping, what lamentation among friends when husband left wife so dear to him, his children, and all his possessions, father and mother, brother and sister, and all his other relatives. But grief was mixed with exultation. They were setting out on the greatest adventure of their age, a holy pilgrimage and a just war combined. God himself had called them to this task. Surely he would not abandon them on the long road ahead. The march of madness was over. The march of armies had begun. By the spring of 1097, Constantinople witnessed a sight unseen for centuries. The greatest armies of Western Europe were camped outside its massive walls, their tents spreading like a vast city of canvas and wood. Emperor Alexios watched from the palace windows with deep unease. He had asked for mercenaries. What he got were independent armies, each following its own proud leader, each with its own ambitions. The first to arrive had been Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, who styled himself Hugh the Great. After being shipwrecked on the Albanian coast and rescued by Byzantine forces, Hugh found himself less a guest than a polite prisoner until he swore an oath of loyalty to the emperor. This would set the pattern for all who followed. Godfrey of Bouillon came next, leading an army from Lorraine. Tall, fair-haired, deeply religious, Godfrey had sold his entire duchy to finance his crusade. He would accept no earthly reward, he declared, save the privilege of praying at Christ's tomb. But when Alexios demanded he swear that the same oath as Hugh, Godfrey balked. Why should he, a duke in his own right, bow to this Greek emperor? For months, a tense standoff developed. Alexios cut off food supplies to force compliance. Godfrey's men raided the suburbs in response. Small skirmishes broke out between Crusaders and imperial troops. It seemed the great expedition might end in Christians fighting Christians before a single Muslim had been engaged. Anna Komnenos, watching from the palace, later wrote with barely concealed contempt, "The Frankish counts are brazen-faced, violent men, money grubbers and totally shameless. They're all unbearably boastful, and anything that is said to them or any attempt to discipline them is taken as a mortal insult." But Alexios was a master of diplomacy. Through a mixture of threats, bribes and promises, he won over each leader in turn. Godfrey eventually swore the oath after Alexios demonstrated Byzantine military might by having his troops shoot arrows over the Crusader camp, each one landing precisely where intended. The message was clear: cooperate or face the empire's full strength. Bohemond of Taranto proved easier to manage. This Norman adventurer, son of Robert Guiscard, who had terrorized Byzantine Italy, saw opportunity where others saw humiliation. He swore the oath eagerly, hoping to be named commander of all imperial forces in Asia. His ambition was naked, but at least it was predictable. Raymond of Toulouse, the oldest and wealthiest of the crusading princes, proved most stubborn. This grizzled veteran of wars against Spanish Muslims refused to swear full homage, agreeing only to a modified oath promising not to harm imperial interests. Alexios, recognizing he had pushed as far as he could, accepted. By May of 1097, the armies had crossed into Asia Minor. The combined force numbered perhaps 35,000 fighting men, plus thousands more non-combatants. It was the largest Western European army assembled since Charlemagne, a steel-clad tide rolling toward the Holy Land. Their first target was Nicaea, capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the city where the Nicene Creed had been formulated, where Constantine had presided over the first great council of the Christian Church, was now the seat of Muslim power in Anatolia. Its walls were formidable, its garrison strong, its symbolic importance immense. The siege began in May. For the Crusaders, it was a harsh introduction to Eastern warfare. The Turks were not the static defenders they had expected. Sultan Kilij Arslan, who had destroyed the People's Crusade so easily, now faced a real military threat. His mounted archers harassed the besiegers constantly, appearing from nowhere to loose clouds of arrows before vanishing into the hills. One crusader wrote home, "These Turks use a diabolic art of war. They shoot arrows while fleeing, turning in their saddles like demons. Our knights in heavy armour cannot catch them, and our foot soldiers are helpless against their mounted attacks." But the Crusaders adapted. They learned to coordinate infantry and cavalry, to use their crossbows to outrange Turkish bows, to build siege engines that could batter even Nicaea's mighty walls. Most importantly, they learned to work together. French, Norman, German, and Italian contingents slowly forged themselves into a unified army. The siege dragged on for weeks. Food ran short, disease spread through the camps. The summer heat of Anatolia, so different from cool European forests, tormented men in heavy armour, but religious fervour sustained them. Priests held daily services. Visions and miracles were reported. A shower of meteorites was interpreted as a sign of God's favour. Then, just as the walls began to crack under bombardment, the Crusaders woke to see Byzantine flags flying over Nicaea. Alexios had secretly negotiated the city's surrender during the night. The garrison and population would be spared, their property protected, in exchange for returning to imperial control. The Crusaders were furious. They had been denied their plunder, their chance for vengeance against the infidel. But Alexios had what he wanted, a key city returned to the empire without destruction. It was a reminder that Byzantine and Crusader goals were not always aligned. From Nicaea, the army marched southeast into the Anatolian plateau. Now the real suffering began. This was some of the harshest terrain on earth, a high desert of scorching days and freezing nights. Water sources were scarce and often poisoned by retreating Turks. The heavily armoured knights, pride of European warfare, found their strength sapped by heat and thirst. On July 1st, 1097, near the village of Dorilaeum, Kilij Arslan struck. The Turkish army, perhaps 50,000 strong, fell upon the Crusader vanguard led by Bohemond. For hours the Normans fought desperately, forming a defensive circle while mounted archers poured arrows into their ranks. Robert of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, described the battle. "They came upon us like a whirlwind, surrounding us on all sides, shooting arrows from an incredible distance. We could not fight them as we fight in our own lands. They would not stand and face us, but fled when we charged, all the while shooting behind them." Just when it seemed Bohemond's force would be overwhelmed, the main Crusader army arrived. Godfrey of Bouillon led a massive charge that smashed into the Turkish flank. Raymond of Toulouse attacked from another direction. Caught between multiple forces, the Turkish army broke and fled. Dorilaeum was the Crusaders' first great victory, and it changed everything. The myth of Turkish invincibility was shattered. More importantly, the various contingents had fought as one army, saving each other from destruction. They were no longer French or Norman or Italian. They were Crusaders, brothers in arms. But the march across Anatolia tested that brotherhood to its limits. The Turks adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and poisoning wells. Horses died by the hundreds. Knights were reduced to riding oxen or walking in armour. The elderly and sick were left by the roadside. Women gave birth on the march, often losing their infants to heat and disease. One chronicler wrote, "You would see proud knights reduced to beggars, selling their arms for bread. Noble ladies walked barefoot over burning sand. The army that had left Constantinople in splendour now looked like a procession of ghosts. Yet they pressed on, driven by faith and the promise of Jerusalem. When they reached the Christian lands of Armenian Cilicia, they were welcomed as liberators.